How is this going to change, Brian, the balance of power in the region?
Well, these were defensive strikes that the president ordered. We have American troops that are in Iraq for a very specific mission to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. Those American troops are located at Iraqi military bases. And over the last 2 months, there have been almost a dozen attacks by Iranian proxies against those bases. And then a couple of days ago, an American was killed. A number of American soldiers were injured, and also some Iraqi soldiers were injured. And so the president decided to, and as an act of defense, ordered airstrikes, 3 in Iraq, 2 in Syria. And we're also trying to send a message to Iran that they need to stop this.
Telling them to stay in their lane. Iran should stay in Iran, not meddle in Iraq.
Right, exactly. And Iran has been running an expansionist foreign policy for 40 years. This is the last revolutionary regime on earth. The president's made very clear that he's shown a lot of restraint in light of Iranian provocations. But we also made clear that we will take decisive action if there is an injury or harm to our personnel or interests. And so then you had the military response just yesterday.
You and I have spoken previously about the maximum economic pressure campaign against Tehran, and you just alluded to their expansionary policies. I hear what you're saying. I read the reports, and I'm curious. It would appear that more sanctions are likely on the table, and more sanctions in the short term.
Yeah, right now Iran is facing its worst financial crisis in its 40-year history. This is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as we look ahead to 2020, unless Iran starts behaving like a normal nation, you're going to start seeing many more sanctions. So we've put in place the most pressure in the last 40 years against this regime. We've put in place, and so they're deep into a recession. We have collapsed their oil exports. We have collapsed their all of the foreign direct investment into Iran. And we're going to continue to drive up the costs on the regime for behaving like an outlaw country.
So more sanctions could still happen?
Very likely.
Meanwhile, there's protests, not just in Iran, but all throughout the region. How have they been influencing the Shia as a proxy force in the region?
Well, you've seen protests now. It's an amazing phenomenon. You've seen protests in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon occurring at the same time. And in all 3 countries, massive protests. And in all 3 countries, the consistent thread is an opposition to the Iranian regime. The people in each of these countries are tired of Iran's model of corruption and sectarian violence and also terrible economic conditions. This is a regime that prioritizes ideology over the welfare of their own people. And whenever they go into countries like Lebanon or Iraq, it always makes things worse for the people in those countries.
And meanwhile, Secretary Pompeo giving a speech on Iran just the other week about their human rights violations, and he mentioned that the Iranians have submitted something like 36,000 tips and submissions using social media platforms, and that the administration has been using these submissions of violations of the Iranian regime to piece together some of these horrific human rights violations. What's that number up to now?
It's now up to 45,000.
45,000.
And so there were 2 things we did when the protests started. We stood with the Iranian people. The President, the Secretary of State, very clearly expressed their support for the demands the Iranian people were making on their own government. And then the Secretary also created essentially a tip box for Iranians to submit photos, videos, and messages of regime violence against its own people. We've had 45,000 submissions done through Telegram.
And just, quickly, in several weeks ago when I spoke with you after that exchange of prisoners, and in fact, a U.S. prisoner who was being detained by Iran, you worked virtually, round the clock to get that individual released. And it appeared that maybe there was just going to be a glimmer of hope that things would be trending in a positive direction. Do you still have that hope, or is the events of the last 24 hours just completely walked it back?
Well, we made clear that there are 2 tracks. There's the dialogue where we try to get the Americans who are wrongly detained in Iran, get them out of Iran and bring them back home to their loved ones, back to the United States. The other track is where we're advancing our national security objectives. And Iran presents many threats to peace and security: the nuclear threat, missile threat, regional aggression, and the hostage taking of Americans. So we are going to continue these two tracks. We're going to try to get the remaining Americans out of prison in Iran, but we're going to continue to execute our campaign of maximum economic pressure.